The rain came down like it had a grudge against Seoul. It hammered the streets in thick silver sheets, turning the Han River's reflection into a shattered mirror and driving every sensible person indoors. But the guests arriving at the Grand Latte Palace Hotel barely noticed. They stepped from their sleek black cars beneath wide umbrellas held by white-gloved attendants, their designer heels clicking against marble steps that had been towel-dried every 3 minutes by staff too nervous to blink. Inside, the hotel blazed with warm golden light, with crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's apartments, and with the kind of laughter that only comes when money removes all reasons to worry. Korea's most elite had gathered tonight for the Kong Foundation annual charity gala, though the more honest word for it was performance. A performance of generosity, of importance, of access. Bidding paddles would rise for art that would never be hung. Checks would be written for causes that would be forgotten by Monday. And at the center of it all, as he was at the center of most things in Seoul's business world, stood Kang Min-jae. He was 30 years old and he wore it like a throne. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp cheekbones that photographers had described in publications as architectural. Min-jae occupied the room the way weather occupies a sky, completely and without asking permission. He stood near the east window with a glass of Chateau Petrus he hadn't touched, listening to a fund manager explain something about quarterly projections. He nodded at the right moments. He asked a precise question that made the man stutter. Then he excused himself with a politeness so controlled it barely qualified as warmth. It wasn't that Min-jae disliked people. He had simply spent 30 years watching people perform for proximity to power, and the theater had long since bored him. He had been the youngest CEO in Kong Group's 100-year history, taking the position at 26 after his father's health declined. He had tripled the company's international revenue in 4 years. He had been on the cover of Forbes Asia twice. He had also been engaged once, briefly, to Han Sorin, actress, socialite, the kind of woman the internet called perfect, and had ended that quietly because he found that even perfection could be a performance. He wanted something real. He had simply stopped believing he would find it in rooms like this one. Sir, his assistant, Park Ji-hoon, appeared at his elbow. The young man had the permanent expression of someone calculating disaster probabilities. Senator Yu is asking if you'll say a few words before the auction. In 10 minutes. Of course. Ji-hoon hesitated. Also, the rain is causing some delays outside. Some protesters were seen near the east entrance earlier. Something about the Mapo district redevelopment. Min-jae's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Handle it. Yes, sir. The Mapo situation was a headache he'd inherited rather than created. A corrupt project manager had pushed a demolition 6 weeks early, before residents had received proper notice or compensation, and an entire block of small family businesses had been flattened before anyone senior enough to stop it had found out. Min-jae had fired the manager. He had opened an internal investigation. He had done what he considered the appropriate corrective steps. But the press had been circling, and the timing was ugly. He was moving toward the senator when the doors exploded open. Not opened. Exploded. Both grand mahogany doors swung back against the walls with a crash that silenced the string quartet mid-note and sent champagne sloshing from a dozen glasses. Every head turned, and through those doors came a woman. She was soaking wet from the crown of her head to the soles of her sneakers. Her dark curly hair had been flattened and then re-expanded by the rain into something enormous and wild, haloed by the hotel's entrance lights. She wore a gray hoodie with a bleach stain near the pocket, ripped jeans that were more dark water than denim at this point, and white sneakers that had gone entirely gray. She was tall, nearly 5'9", and she moved like she'd never once in her 25 years been intimidated by a single room she'd walked into. Behind her, attached to each of her arms like the world's most reluctant accessories, were 2 of the hotel's security guards. They were big men, trained men. They were also completely failing to stop her because she wasn't fighting them. She was simply walking forward with a purpose so absolute that their resistance didn't register as a relevant variable. Zara Williams looked across the frozen, glittering room full of Korea's richest people in their most expensive clothes, and she found Min-jae's face in approximately 4 seconds. She pointed at him like a verdict. You! Her voice had no trouble filling the room. It had the kind of natural projection that came from a childhood spent in a loud household, in a neighborhood where you announced yourself or got overlooked, in a family where her grandmother had always said that a woman's voice was her first dignity and she should never swallow it for anyone's comfort. The whole gala held its breath. Min-jae turned slowly, the way a man turns when he is in charge of his own reactions and intends to demonstrate it. His dark eyes found her. He studied the wild hair, the soaked hoodie, the fire in her expression. He had genuinely never seen her before in his life. Zara was already crossing the room, moving between pearl-draped matrons and stiff-backed executives who stepped aside less from courtesy and more from the sheer velocity of her arrival. She reached him, grabbed the lapel of his custom-tailored jacket, the jacket that had been made for him in Milan and had a 3-month waiting list, and she pulled him down to her eye level with a grip that suggested she'd worked physical jobs and wasn't fragile about it. "You rich liar," she said. Her accent was American, southern edges softened by years of New York, voice rough with exhaustion and something that was trying very hard not to be grief. "You forgot me?" Min-jae looked into her eyes. They were dark brown with gold near the iris, which was a strange thing to notice, but he noticed it. He also noticed that she was shaking slightly, though from cold or emotion he couldn't tell. "I have never seen you in my life," he said, perfectly level. Something shifted in her expression. A flash of something more complicated than anger, and then she released his lapel and slapped one open palm against his chest. Not a violent slap. More like a punctuation mark. "Exactly. That's the problem." The room erupted in whispers. Phones rose like a slow tide. Camera flashes began. Min-jae glanced at Ji-hoon, who had gone the color of copy paper. "Sir," Ji-hoon said faintly. "We're already trending." Min-jae gritted his teeth. "Who are you?" he said to Zara, keeping his voice quiet and controlled. "And what do you want?" She stepped back, looked around the room at all the recording phones and whispering mouths, and then, with a decision that was clearly either brilliant or catastrophic, she stepped up onto the nearest chair and then onto the table behind it. A floral centerpiece toppled. A waiter made a desperate lunge for a glass and missed. From her elevated position, Zara surveyed the room like she was addressing a town hall. Her soaked sneakers left wet prints on the white linen. "My name is Zara Williams," she announced. "I am from Atlanta, Georgia, United States of America, and this man's company bulldozed my grandmother's market. Her family business. 43 years of operation. Gone in one morning because some corrupt manager decided the paperwork could wait." Her voice cracked slightly on the word grandmother and then firmed back up like she'd grabbed it by the collar. "My grandmother spent everything she had on that market. My mother grew up behind that counter. I grew up visiting it every summer. And these people took it and sent a form letter." The room was completely silent now. Not the polite silence of wealth at dinner. The stunned silence of an audience that had not expected tonight to matter. Min-jae watched her. He was running calculations, PR damage, stock implications, legal exposure, but beneath all of that, something else was also happening. Something he didn't have a spreadsheet for. "What do you want?" he asked again. She looked down at him from the table. And then, because the universe apparently had a sense of humor, Zara Williams crossed her arms and said, "A husband." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the Grand Latte Palace Hotel's ballroom detonated into noise. 3 hours later, the gala was technically still occurring but spiritually had ended the moment Zara climbed that table. Min-jae sat in the hotel's private meeting room across from his grandfather, Kang Sung-won, chairman emeritus, who had arrived from his residence with the unhurried energy of a man who had survived 4 economic recessions, 2 corporate scandals, and 1 actual typhoon, and considered this current situation mildly interesting. Zara sat on the other side of the table with a hotel towel around her shoulders, her curly hair now partly dry and fully enormous, holding a cup of hot tea with both hands because she was still cold from the rain. Ji-hoon sat in the corner looking like he was composing his resignation letter mentally. On the chairman's tablet, the hashtag CEO exposed was #1 in Korea. The clip of Zara grabbing Min-jae's tie had 4 million views. An American news outlet had already picked it up. "The investors are nervous," Min-jae said flatly. "We can issue a statement. Acknowledge the Mapo situation. Announce expanded compensation for affected families. Statements," his grandfather said pleasantly, "are for people who have not already gone viral." Min-jae stopped. Chairman Kang set down his tea with the deliberateness of a man about to say something he had already fully decided. He looked at Zara. "Miss Williams, you said you wanted a husband." Zara, who had been quietly calculating whether the hotel would charge for the tea, looked up. I was being dramatic. Of course. But consider this undramatically. The chairman folded his hands. My grandson needs to demonstrate that his concern for your family's situation is not political performance but personal commitment. You need substantial compensation and, I suspect, someone to help you navigate whatever legal and logistical battles you came here to fight. A contract marriage, 1 year, would address both. Zara stared at him. Then she looked at Min-jae. Min-jae's expression was the face of a man being asked to swallow something very large without water. You want us to get married, Zara said slowly. Contractually. For 1 year. After which you will divorce amicably. You will receive a settlement that will more than restore your family's losses. And my grandson will have demonstrated to the public that this situation was resolved with integrity. Zara was quiet for a long moment. Min-jae watched her process it. Watched something move behind her eyes that he couldn't name yet. Do I get a mansion? She asked. Min-jae closed his eyes. You would reside in the family estate, yes, Chairman Kong said. Zara nodded very slowly. A smile began somewhere in the corner of her mouth and spread with the unstoppable patience of sunrise. Okay, she said. But I have conditions. She arrived with 4 suitcases, a rice cooker, a portable Bluetooth speaker the size of a small engine, approximately 11 bottles of hot sauce in a reusable bag, a plastic container of jollof rice her auntie had made her promise to eat before it went bad, and her auntie herself technically in the form of a video call that had been running continuously since Incheon Airport and showed no signs of ending. Min-jae watched the procession from the top of the estate's front steps with the expression of a general watching an enemy approach from a direction he had not anticipated. She's beautiful, his housekeeper Mrs. Cho said beside him, slightly awed. She's a hurricane, Min-jae said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, sir. He had a list. He had prepared a list, which was how Min-jae handled every new variable. He identified parameters, established expectations, and created structure. He had spent the previous evening drafting the house rules with the same precision he brought to acquisition agreements. He intercepted Zara in the marble foyer while the staff were still exchanging alarmed looks over her luggage situation. There are some guidelines for shared residence, he said, producing the neatly folded paper. Zara took it, glanced at it, then looked up at him. You actually made a list. Several of these points are non-negotiable. She read aloud. No shouting, no mess, no unauthorized guests, no dancing in communal spaces, no touching personal belongings. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her hoodie pocket. Okay. He studied her. It had been too easy. Okay. She picked up her Bluetooth speaker. Where's my room? Mrs. Cho showed her upstairs. Min-jae returned to his study, allowed himself precisely 90 seconds of cautious optimism, and then heard it. Afrobeats, pulsing through the floor of the estate like a second heartbeat, big and warm and completely unapologetic. Not quietly from her room, from the kitchen which was on the other side of the house. He found her there 4 minutes later. She had connected the speaker to some acoustic point in the kitchen that made it sound like the room itself was playing music. She was demonstrating a dance step to 3 of the kitchen staff who were watching with the intensity of students before an exam, and Chef Park, a 53-year-old man who had trained in Paris, was attempting to replicate her hip movement with the focused commitment of someone who refused to fail at anything. You were supposed to be in your room, Min-jae said. I was hungry. She gestured at the stove, where something was already smelling extraordinary. I'm making eggs. You want some? I have a chef. And now your chef is learning to dance, so. She turned back to the lesson. Min-jae watched Chef Park miss a beat and try again. He watched the 2 younger kitchen staff laugh and cover their mouths. He watched Zara encourage them with the easy warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed other people's joy and wasn't performing it. He turned the music down manually from the panel near the door. Zara turned it back up from her phone. They looked at each other. This, Min-jae understood, was going to be a longer year than he had projected. What he had not projected, and what began to happen over the following 2 weeks with a gradualness that made it harder to resist, was the way the house changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but Mrs. Cho started smiling before noon, which had not previously been her pattern. The kitchen staff lingered after their shifts longer than necessary. Even the groundskeeper, a taciturn man who communicated primarily through meaningful silences, had been seen nodding along to something while raking gravel. Zara was not trying to charm anyone. That was the thing that confused Min-jae most about her. Every woman he'd spent significant time near, and he was aware that this was the reality of his life, had been aware of him as an audience. Not cruelly, not cynically, but aware, adjusting, performing some version of themselves that was calibrated for his presence. Zara seemed to have missed the memo that he was the most powerful person in most rooms. She argued with him about the thermostat. She left her shoes in the entryway despite being told twice. She commandeered the secondary living room for video calls with her auntie, her college friends, her cousin Marcus, who was apparently very funny based on how hard she laughed, and once, inexplicably, a woman named Ms. Patricia from her grandmother's old church who wanted to know everything about Korea and spent 40 minutes asking Zara questions, while Min-jae tried to read a report 3 rooms away and kept hearing Zara's laugh anyway. He noticed things he didn't mean to notice. She read before bed. Real books, not screens, thick paperbacks she hauled around in a canvas bag. She put hot sauce on things he didn't think were architecturally suited to hot sauce. She was learning Korean from a battered phrasebook and practiced on the staff, getting the tones completely wrong in ways that made them laugh and correct her with patient delight. She called her grandmother's name into conversations the way you mention someone who's still present in the room. Not with grief, but with the living, ongoing love of someone whose absence you refuse to make permanent. He was not supposed to find any of this interesting. He found all of it interesting. The moment that cracked something open happened on a Tuesday. He'd come down at midnight for water. He didn't sleep well, hadn't since his 20s, something his doctors had opinions about, and found the kitchen dark except for the light above the stove, and Zara sitting on the counter eating cold rice with a spoon, watching a video on her phone with one earbud in. She pulled the earbud out when she saw him. Couldn't sleep. I came for water. There's water in your room. You have a full bathroom. She studied him. And a mini fridge I found while snooping, which you should know about. You were snooping? Exploring. It's a big house. She offered him a spoonful of rice. He stared at it. She withdrew it and ate it herself. You want to tell me why you actually came downstairs? Or are we doing the water story? Min-jae was quiet for a moment. He got his glass of water. He leaned against the counter opposite her. What are you watching? She angled her phone so he could see. A video of a market, outdoor, colorful, full of people. An older woman in a bright orange headwrap haggling cheerfully with a customer over the price of plantains. My grandma's market, Zara said. My cousin filmed it like 2 years before she died. Before everything. Min-jae watched the video. The old woman on screen threw her head back and laughed at something, and even in the tiny phone screen and poor lighting of the kitchen, you could see the life in her. She looks like you, he said. Zara looked at him sharply, then back at the phone. Her jaw moved. Yeah, she said quietly. She does. Han So-rin arrived on a Wednesday, because she had always had a gift for timing. She appeared at the estate without calling ahead, which she knew was one of the things Min-jae tolerated from her specifically, because they had known each other long enough that the rules had different textures. She was dressed impeccably. She was always dressed impeccably. It was practically a career requirement. In cream silk and heels that added 4 unnecessary inches to a height that was already sufficient. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was the kind that made you forget there was any makeup there at all. She had, by every external measure, nothing to be insecure about. She also had, in Min-jae's estimation, come here to assess Zara. This was not a courtesy visit. Zara was in the secondary dining room eating cereal directly from the box. She'd explained this habit to Mrs. Cho as efficiency, and wearing oversized pajama pants printed with cartoon clouds and a sleep shirt from a 2019 music festival. Her hair was in a pineapple on top of her head. She had one knee pulled to her chest and was watching something on the estate's TV with the remote balanced on her knee. So-rin came around the corner and stopped. Zara looked up. Oh, hi. She assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds. You must be the ex. I am not his ex. So-rin's voice was smooth and cool. Min-jae and I were engaged. Right? Zara offered the cereal box in a gesture of vague hospitality. So the ex. Min-jae appeared in the doorway behind So-rin with the specific expression of a man who had been walking toward a room and was now deeply regretting the physics that prevented him from walking backward through time. So-rin, he said, I didn't know you were coming. I wanted to see how you were managing. Soren's gaze moved around the room, the cereal box, the cartoon pajamas, the volume of the television, the general domestic chaos that Zara generated the way certain weather systems generate. I can see you're managing. We're great, Zara said pleasantly. He actually smiled yesterday. It was terrifying. I didn't know his face could do that. Soren looked at Min-jae with an expression Zara couldn't fully read. I need to speak with you privately. Sure, Min-jae said. He was already moving toward the door. Then he stopped, turned back. Zara, come join us in the study. Both women looked at him with surprise for different reasons. It concerns you as much as me, he said. His voice was even, but there was something deliberate in it. Something that had chosen a side. Soren's expression shifted by a degree too subtle to call out but too clear to miss. Zara set down the cereal box, unfolded herself from the couch, and padded across the room in her socks. In the study, Soren made her case. She had connections to media outlets that had been preparing to run a deeper story on the Mapo demolition situation. Internal leaked documents suggesting that the mismanagement had gone higher than the fired project manager. She was willing to delay those connections, she said. Her PR team had been managing coverage strategically. There were ways to shape this, if Min-jae would be willing to reconsider some of his recent decisions. Min-jae heard her out the way he heard most things. Completely, without expression. Then he said, which decisions? The contract arrangement. Soren's eyes moved briefly to Zara. It's being perceived as reactive. Unstable. If you were seen with someone more? She paused, constructing the next word carefully. Contextually aligned. You mean someone who isn't black and American and came in through the front door of a gala dripping rain on the floor? Zara said. Silence. I didn't say that, Soren said precisely. You also didn't not say it. Zara, Min-jae said. Not to quiet her, she noticed. More like he was marking where she stood. He looked at Soren. I'm not going to manage this situation by replacing the person at the center of it with someone more politically convenient. And I'm not going to be leveraged with leaked documents. He stood up. If your contacts publish, we'll respond. Directly. With full transparency about everything that happened and everything we've done to address it. He opened the study door. Thank you for coming. Soren looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Zara, and something in her expression acknowledged, without warmth but without cruelty, that she was reading a room she'd lost before she entered it. She left. In the quiet after, Zara sat in the chair she'd taken and looked at her socks. They had little planets on them. She'd bought them at a dollar store near her apartment in Queens 3 years ago and refused to retire them on principle. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. She could make things harder. She could. He sat back down at his desk. She was already making something harder, but it wasn't business. Zara looked up at him. He was already looking at his papers. Professionally unavailable, as he often was after saying something that mattered. She was starting to recognize the pattern. The way he said real things and then immediately retreated to competence, using work like a trapdoor. She didn't push it. She picked up her cereal box from where she'd left it on his bookshelf and went back to her pajamas and her television. But something had shifted. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before the weather, but already knowing rain was coming. The nights were when she forgot the contract. Not because of romance, not at first, but because the contract was a daytime document. It governed public appearances and household logistics and legal terms and the version of them that other people needed to believe. At night, there were no cameras, no investors, no PR considerations. There was just the estate in the dark, and two people who were both, underneath their very different exteriors, carrying weight. They had not fully put down. She found him in the garden at 1 in the morning. Not for the first time. Min-jae had a habit of walking the garden at night when he couldn't sleep, which was often. He moved through it without a phone or a tablet, which Zara found notable because he otherwise moved through the world attached to information like it was oxygen. In the garden, in the dark, he was just a man walking slowly among his grandfather's roses, hands behind his back, looking at things that weren't looking back. She'd started joining him without announcing that she was joining him, which he'd allowed without acknowledging that he'd allowed it. They had developed a language of comfortable silences that neither of them had named. She told him about her grandmother properly on the 4th night. Not just the market, the whole of her. Nana Jean, who had emigrated from Nigeria at 22 with one suitcase, and the specific ferocity of a woman who had decided that her children would not want for anything, ever, regardless of what it cost her. Who had built the market from a folding table on a sidewalk. Who had raised Zara's mother and then, when life scattered the family in complicated directions, had raised Zara too, summers and school breaks and eventually a full 3 years when Zara was in middle school and her mother was getting herself back together. Who had made jollof rice every Friday and required everyone present to eat until they stopped being sad. Who had sent Zara to college with a check that Zara only later understood represented most of Nana Jean's savings. She never told me it was hard, Zara said. The garden was dark and smelled like night-blooming jasmine and the distant city. That's the part one keep coming back to. She never let it look hard. She just kept feeding people, kept showing up. And then they took the one thing she'd built and she got so sick so fast, and I kept thinking if I'd known, if I'd had more money, if I'd been smarter, I could have. You were 25, Min-jae said. She'd had a birthday 2 weeks after arriving. You could not have foreseen a corrupt property manager circumventing oversight systems. I know that. Knowing it doesn't help. No, she exhaled. It doesn't. She looked over at him. Do you have someone? That you lost, that you. My father, he said. Brief, final in tone. Then, after a pause, slightly less final. He was ill for several years before I took over the company. He taught me everything he could in the time he had. I was with him at the end. He paused again. He would have thought this situation was extraordinary. Yeah. He appreciated chaos. It was very inconvenient. Zara laughed, and the sound of it moved through the garden. And she saw Min-jae's face in the low light do something complicated and quiet that she was beginning to understand was what his smiling looked like when he forgot to prevent it. The market project was Min-jae's idea, but he presented it to Zara like a contract negotiation, which was how he offered things that mattered, formally, so the feeling couldn't be refused on emotional grounds. The MAPO compensation for affected families will include restoration of commercial spaces, he said, spreading plans across the dining room table. We are designating an international food street as part of the new development. I am proposing one of the anchor stalls be a permanent tribute to your grandmother's market. Her name, her menu if you want, staffed by your family, if any of them want to relocate, or by people you choose. Zara stared at the blueprints. Her finger moved over the rendering of a warm-lit corner space with large windows and a hand-painted sign. Nana Jeans, he said. That's what I suggested for the name. But you should decide. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Min-jae waited, which he had gotten better at over the past months. She would have said the name was too simple, Zara finally said. She had very strong opinions about naming. She would have wanted something that made people curious. She traced the sign. How about Jean's Table? Jean's Table, he repeated. Yes. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the quiet attention he'd developed over months of looking at her in moments when he thought she couldn't see, or maybe in moments when he had stopped hiding that he was looking. She had learned to read him the way you learn a difficult text. Slowly, with patience, coming back to passages you don't understand until suddenly you do. Why are you doing this? She asked. The contract required compensation. It didn't require this. No, he agreed. He looked back at the blueprints. It didn't. She waited for more. He offered the particular silence that she now knew meant he had said the most he currently could, and that the rest was visible if she already knew where to look. She was beginning to know where to look. The public part of their arrangement had been, by every measurable standard, successful. They had appeared at 4 events together. Zara had worn 3 outfits chosen in battle negotiation with Min-jae's stylist, and 1 outfit she had picked herself that turned out to photograph beautifully. She had given 1 brief media statement, direct and unscripted, about the Mapo families and what accountability should look like, that had been replayed on 3 news networks. Min-jae had made it a practice to stand next to her rather than in front of her, which the internet had noticed with the thoroughness the internet applied to everything. She had also, 3 weeks in, told his grandfather that his feng shui was wrong, and the chairman had laughed so hard he'd had to sit down. Since then, he invited her to tea twice a week on his own, and they talked for hours, and Min-jae came home on those evenings to a grandfather who was more animated than he'd been in years. She argues with me, Chairman Kong told him delightedly, about everything. She's always done her research. I know, Min-jae said, and she makes me eat properly. She told my doctor that he was being too gentle with me. That sounds right. She is, the chairman said, in the tone of a man closing an argument. Good for this family. Min-jae said nothing. This also, he suspected, sounded right. When the year came to its legal end, Ji-hoon prepared the documents with the painful thoroughness of a man who had watched things get complicated and was hoping paperwork might uncomplicate them. The ceremony for signing, which was a generous word for what was essentially two people sitting in a lawyer's office with contracts, had been scheduled for a Tuesday. Min-jae arrived precisely on time. Zara arrived 6 minutes late because she'd been on the phone with her cousin Marcus and had lost track. She sat down across from Min-jae looking like herself, which at this point he could have described in exhaustive detail, a fact that occupied him during the moments when he allowed himself to notice things. The lawyer presented the documents. Min-jae picked up his pen. He looked at the paper. He thought about the garden at 1 in the morning. He thought about a woman who laughed so you'd think she had no pain. He thought about the way she'd looked at the blueprints for Jean's table, and how the word forever had begun, sometime in the past year, to feel less like a burden and more like the thing you worked toward when you found someone worth the distance. He set the pen down. He picked up the papers. He tore them in half with the clean, decisive motion of a man accustomed to making irreversible decisions and standing behind them fully. The lawyer made a small distressed sound. Zara stared at the two halves of the document. Those were legally binding, she said, and now they're not. He moved around the table and the world seemed to renegotiate its geometry around this. Around him crossing a room not for business, not with calculation, but with the simple and total intention of being nearer to her. He didn't kneel exactly, but he leaned down so they were level, and looked at her in the direct, undefended way he'd spent most of his life not looking at anyone. I've been thinking, he said, that the contract addressed the wrong problem. The problem was never the scandal or the optics or the compensation structure. What was the problem? She asked, though her voice had shifted into something softer. I had stopped believing I'd find someone real. And then you burst through a door in soaking wet clothes and grabbed my tie in front of 400 people. And I didn't know what you were yet, but I knew you were real. Zara pressed her lips together. Her eyes had gone bright. You still dance badly, she said. I know. And then Kang Min-jae, CEO, 30 years old, man who made billion-dollar decisions without blinking, man who had spent a decade being immovable, smiled. Fully. Without retreating. Teach me. Not for a year. For as long as you want. She stared at him for 3 seconds that probably contained several complete lifetimes. Then she launched herself at him, arms around his neck, laughing and crying simultaneously in the way that only happens when something is exactly right. And he caught her completely, and held on with both arms and didn't let go. In the corner, Ji-hoon was crying quietly and pretending he wasn't. The lawyer was looking at the torn papers and calculating his invoice. And somewhere across the city, in a development called Mapo Renewal Quarter, a team of workers was hanging a hand-painted wooden sign above a warm-lit corner stall with large windows. Jean's table, where everyone eats until they stop being sad. Chairman Kang heard the news by phone that evening. He sat in his study for a moment after hanging up, looking at nothing in particular. Then he poured himself a small glass of plum wine, raised it toward some general point in the universe, and said, "Best decision the boy ever made." Then he called Zara's phone directly. She answered on the second ring, still laughing.
Hi guys, in this story we learn that true love is not found in perfection, wealth, or status. It is found in honesty, kindness, healing, and accepting someone exactly as they are. Zara and Minji both changed each other's lives because they were real with each other. She brought warmth into his cold world and helped her heal pain with genuine care. Kindly like and subscribe.